Becky's hands moved rhythmically as she kneaded the dough, her laughter carrying through the small home. Outside, Peterson adjusted the straps on his cart, his eyes warm as he glanced at her through the window. She turned, catching his gaze, and the moment stretched between them, a silent promise of love and partnership. He approached her, kissed her forehead, and murmured his thanks before heading to the market. Becky's gaze lingered on him, her heart swelling with pride. Evenings were spent beneath the ancient baobab tree. The day's weariness dissolved into the melody of their shared stories. The stars above bore witness to their laughter, a harmony that echoed through the night. Life was full of promise, each moment a precious note in the song they composed together. Customers huddled at a rival trader's stall, lured by the promise of better prices. Peterson stood behind his own counter, his brow furrowed but his chin held high. He greeted every passerby with his usual charm, though the smile no longer reached his eyes. Days turned to weeks, and his once bustling stall stood increasingly barren. At home, Becky noticed the subtle shifts. The gifts stopped arriving. Peterson's shoulders sagged as he entered the house, his words fewer, his silences longer. She reached for his hand one evening beneath the baobab tree, but he withdrew, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Peterson approached friends with measured words and promises he believed he could keep. But as one favor led to another, his confidence eroded. Becky noticed the strain deepening in his face. She tried to comfort him, but his responses grew curt, his patience worn thin. The first time he stumbled home drunk, Becky met him at the door, worry etched across her face. She reached out to steady him, but he shrugged her off, his movements clumsy. "Just needed a drink to think," he muttered, waving her concern away. The second time, her words met a wall of indifference. By the third, he returned with anger etched into his features, the alcohol sharpening his tongue. Becky stood rooted, her hand pressed to her cheek, her breath caught in her throat. Peterson's face was a storm of frustration and shame, but no apology followed. Days passed, and the storm returned. Words turned sharper, actions heavier. Becky's protests and pleas met deaf ears. Late one night, he stumbled in, the stench of alcohol preceding him. Becky sat waiting, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. "Peterson, we need to talk," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. He scoffed, sinking into a chair and waving her off. But she persisted. "You're not this man. I don't know who you've become." For a fleeting moment, his mask cracked, his head dropped into his hands, and his voice trembled. "I feel like I'm drowning, Becky. I don't know how to fix this." She reached for him, her touch hesitant but hopeful. He allowed it for a moment before retreating once more. Becky stared at the faint bruises on her arm, the marks like echoes of a love that once was. The early morning light spilled into the room as she packed a small bag, each item a fragment of her past life. She slipped out of the house, her steps light, her heart heavy. The journey to her parents' home felt endless. When she arrived, her mother's face lit up in surprise, then dimmed as Becky's tears began to fall. They sat together, Becky's words tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. Her father listened, his expression hardening with every word. Her mother gasped, her hands trembling. When silence fell, Becky searched their faces for comfort, for understanding. Her father's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "You cannot leave him, Becky. Marriage is sacred." Her heart sank. "Sacred?" she repeated, her voice rising. "He beats me, father. He forces himself on me. Is this sacred?" Her mother's gaze fell to her lap, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Marriage is not meant to be easy, my dear," she whispered. "You must endure. For the sake of your family." Becky stood, her chest heaving with the weight of their words. The home she once turned to for solace now felt foreign, its walls closing in. She stepped outside, the morning sun warming her face as she stared at the horizon. Tears blurred her vision, but her resolve was clear. If no one else would fight for her, she would have to fight for herself. The room was heavy with silence as Becky stepped back, her chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. Peterson's sobs filled the space, raw and unrestrained. His once commanding presence was now reduced to a trembling shadow of itself, his eyes wide with the realization of his own vulnerability. Becky untied the cloth binding his wrists and ankles with deliberate, unhurried movements. As the last knot came undone, Peterson curled into himself, his body shaking as though trying to shield against a storm that had already passed. Becky stood over him, her voice steady but low. "This isn't revenge, Peterson. This is a mirror. I wanted you to feel, even for a moment, what you have made me endure every single day. Maybe now you'll understand." She turned away, her steps measured as she left the room. The air outside was cool and still, the village quiet under the blanket of night. Becky walked to the baobab tree where she and Peterson once shared laughter and dreams. She leaned against its rough bark, the memories of better times rising unbidden in her mind. A tear slid down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, unwilling to give in to sorrow. Inside the house, Peterson remained on the bed, his sobs subsiding into silence. He lay staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled and chaotic. Shame clawed at him, but so did an unfamiliar sensation, an ache of recognition, of accountability. He had spent so long blaming the world, drowning his failures in alcohol, and lashing out at Becky that he had never stopped to face himself. The room was still, save for Becky's labored breathing as she stepped back. Peterson lay motionless, his eyes wide and glassy, his cheeks streaked with tears. The man who once wielded his strength as a weapon now seemed fragile, a shadow of his former self. His lips trembled, but no words came. Becky straightened, her expression unreadable. She watched him for a moment longer, her gaze cutting through the silence like a blade. Slowly, she moved to the edge of the room and picked up a chair, dragging it across the floor with a deliberate scrape. She sat down, her posture rigid, and spoke evenly. "You will divorce me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you refuse, I'll tell the village everything. Let them see the man behind the mask." Peterson's breath hitched, and his body stiffened. The thought of his reputation unraveling, of the whispers and stares from the villagers, filled him with dread. His voice cracked as he stammered, "I'll do it. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't tell anyone." Becky studied him for a long moment, her eyes cold. Then, without another word, she rose and untied his bindings. Peterson remained on the bed, his limbs trembling as he rubbed his wrists. Becky turned and walked out of the room, leaving him in the suffocating silence of his own shame. Over the next week, Peterson made arrangements to dissolve their marriage. He visited Becky's parents, his voice subdued as he explained that he had decided to part ways with their daughter. Her father frowned, his displeasure evident, but he did not argue. The process was swift, and Becky finally felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. Peterson, meanwhile, found himself adrift. The alcohol that had once dulled his guilt now brought only the sharp sting of memory. He avoided the village bar, too ashamed to face the patrons who had once been his drinking companions. Instead, he sought redemption in hard work, hauling goods for traders and fixing tools for farmers. But the shadows of his past lingered, haunting his every step. Becky moved to a neighboring village, her heart seeking solace far from the prying eyes and murmurs of her old community. There, she began to piece her life back together. She joined the local market, her nimble fingers weaving intricate baskets and sewing vibrant fabrics. The work was therapeutic, each stitch and strand a testament to her resilience. Soon, her craftsmanship gained recognition, and her small business flourished. One sunny morning at the market, a man approached her stall. He was tall, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His hands, roughened by years of farming, cradled a bundle of fresh produce as he greeted her warmly. "Your work is beautiful," he said, his tone sincere. Becky offered a small smile. "Thank you." The man, Matthew, began visiting her stall regularly. They spoke of simple things at first, the weather, the harvest, the market's bustle. Over time, their conversations deepened. Becky found herself drawn to his kindness, his quiet humor, and the way he listened to her without judgment or expectation. But this time, Becky was cautious. She watched how Matthew treated others, how he carried himself in moments of frustration or joy. She let months pass, ensuring her heart was not blinded by fleeting emotions. When Matthew eventually asked her to share his life, Becky felt a quiet certainty. Yes, she said softly. Her answer came not from desperation but from strength, a choice made on her terms. In her old village, Becky's story became legend. Women whispered of her courage, calling her tale the stone that broke the river. It was a lesson, a reminder that even the most patient waters could rise when pushed too far. Peterson lived out his days in quiet solitude, his guilt a constant companion. He worked tirelessly, avoiding the places and people that once fueled his downfall. Though he never found peace, he accepted his fate, knowing he could never undo the pain he had caused. Becky, however, thrived. Her days were filled with love and laughter, her nights with dreams unburdened by fear. She and Matthew built a life together, one rooted in mutual respect and understanding. The river of her life, once turbulent and dark, now flowed freely, reflecting the light of her newfound joy. Becky's story, etched into the fabric of her community, became more than a tale of survival. It became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of despair, one could rise, rebuild, and find peace. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video, and don't forget to share it with friends and family who love heartfelt tales.